He approached me during the gathering after the service. The room was full, people moving quietly between conversations. The particular low murmur of a family brought together by loss. I was standing near the window, holding a cup of tea I hadn't touched. He came from across the room, around my age. Something about him immediately familiar in a way I couldn't place. He stopped in front of me, said my name, said he was sorry for my loss. Then he said he needed to tell me something, that his name was Daniel, that we had the same father. I looked at him, searched his face for something I could challenge, found only that familiar quality I still couldn't name. Then I looked across the room. My father was standing about 10 feet away. He had seen Daniel arrive, had watched the conversation begin, and when our eyes met across that room, he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look on his face told me everything. I turned back to Daniel and said we should find somewhere to sit. We talked for 3 hours. But to understand what those 3 hours meant, you need to know who we had both lost that morning. My grandmother was the kind of person who holds a family together without anyone fully understanding how she does it. Not through authority exactly. Not through the particular force of personality that demands compliance. Through something quieter than that. A specific quality of presence that made everyone around her feel simultaneously seen and settled. She remembered everything, not just birthdays and anniversaries. The details of conversations held years earlier. The particular concern you had mentioned in passing that she had stored and returned to months later with a quiet question that told you she had been thinking about it. She paid attention in a way that most people don't have the patience or the genuine interest to sustain. And people felt that attention, felt the specific warmth of being genuinely known by someone, which is rarer than it should be. She had been a fixed point of the family for as long as I could remember. The house where things happened, where Christmas was, and where it could not have been anywhere else. Where Sunday lunches ran 3 hours longer than they were supposed to because nobody wanted to be the first to leave. Where disagreements between family members somehow resolved themselves without her having to say much. She had a particular way of creating the conditions in which things could settle, without forcing them to. I have been close to her in the specific way you are close to someone who made you feel from childhood that you were interesting. Not remarkable in any performed sense, just interesting, worth paying attention to. She asked me questions as a child that adults rarely ask children. What did I actually think about things? What did I notice? What did I want that I hadn't said out loud yet? Those conversations shaped something in me. The sense that your internal experience was worth articulating. That the things you noticed quietly were worth saying carefully. I owe her more of who I am than I have ever been able to fully account for. She had been unwell for a year before she died. Not dramatically unwell for most of that time. The slow kind of decline that gives you warning while still finding ways to surprise you at the end. I had visited as often as I could. Sat with her in the way you sit with someone when you understand that the number of times remaining is finite and you're trying to be present without making that present too heavy. She remained herself almost until the end. That particular quality of attention intact even when the physical version of her had diminished. In one of the last conversations we had, she said something I have returned to many times since. She said she hoped the people she loved would find each other properly. I took it as the general sentiment of someone thinking about what they were leaving behind. The hope that the family she had held together would continue to hold. I didn't hear anything specific in it. I do now. The funeral was a large gathering. She had lived a long and well-connected life. Friends from decades of different chapters. Extended family members I hadn't seen in years showing up in the way extended family does when the person who is the reason everyone gathered is the person being buried. The church was full. The service was right. The particular combination of grief and celebration that a long, good life deserves. People telling true stories about her. Laughing at the right moments, crying at others, the whole human range of it present in one room. I sat with my immediate family during the service. My father beside me, my mother on his other side, my sister, The familiar geography of a family in a pew. I watched my father during the service. He was composed in the way he is composed at difficult things. Not suppressing, just contained. My grandmother was his mother. Whatever else was true about him, he had loved her genuinely. I could see that in how he held himself that morning. After the service, we moved to the hall for the gathering. Food and drink, and the particular texture of a family reunion that nobody chose, but everyone arrives at. I was standing near the window, thinking about nothing in particular, just present in that half-absorbed way of someone moving through a difficult day. When I saw the man come in, he came through the door the way someone comes in when they're not entirely sure they should be there. Not hesitant exactly, careful, looking around the room with the specific attention of someone locating themselves in an unfamiliar space. I noticed him the way you notice someone unfamiliar at a gathering where most faces are known. Not with suspicion, just with the mild curiosity of someone cataloging who is present. I couldn't place him. Ran through the mental file of extended family members and family friends and people who might have known my grandmother through various parts of her life. He didn't fit any category I had. He was around my age, taller by an inch or two. A certain quality about the way he moved, something in the line of the jaw, something I noticed and passed over without yet understanding why it felt recognizable. He got a drink, stood for a moment, and then he looked directly at me, not the glancing recognition of someone who has spotted a familiar face. A specific look, the kind that contains a decision. He crossed the room. I watched him come, still unable to place him, still running the file in the background. He stopped in front of me, said my name, said he was sorry about my grandmother, that she had sounded like a remarkable person. I thanked him, asked if he had known her. He said not personally, but he had heard about her for years. Then he paused, the pause of someone who has been preparing for a moment and has now arrived at it. He said his name was Daniel, that he had driven a long way to be here, that he had wanted to come for a specific reason, that there was something he needed to tell me. I waited. He said we had the same father. I looked at him, not with immediate understanding, with the blankness that precedes understanding when something is too large to process in a single moment. I said his name back to him, as a question rather than a statement. He said yes, that he had known about me for years, that he understood this was not something I was prepared for, that he wasn't there to cause trouble or create a scene, that he had just wanted to finally meet the family he had never been allowed to know. I stood with that for a moment. The room continued around us. Conversations happening, people moving between groups, the ordinary background of a gathering that had no idea what was occurring in the corner near the window. And I was standing in the middle of it trying to locate my footing. The name Daniel had never appeared in my life. Not in conversation, not in passing, not in the background radiation of family history that accumulates over years whether you pay attention to it or not. This person had not existed in my world at any point before this moment. And yet he was standing in front of me with a specific kind of certainty. Not aggressive, not performing. Certain in the way of someone who has known a thing for a long time and is simply finally saying it to the person who needed to hear it. I looked at his face properly, and the familiarity that I had noticed when he came through the door and hadn't been able to name, started to name itself. Not a mirror, not an obvious resemblance that anyone in the room would have caught immediately. Something more structural than that. Something in the architecture of the face that didn't announce itself, but that was there when you looked directly. Something I shared, something that came from a common source. I felt the specific sensation of a floor shifting, not collapsing, shifting. The particular internal movement that happens when a piece of information arrives that requires you to reorganize something fundamental about how you understand your own life. I said I needed a moment. He said, of course. Said he wasn't going anywhere, that he had waited this long. He could wait a few minutes more. I turned and looked across the room. My father was standing near the far wall, in conversation with two people I vaguely recognized as old friends of my grandmother. He was doing what he had been doing all morning, being present, receiving condolences, holding himself with the contained composure of a man managing grief in public the way he manages most difficult things. In private, without visible seams. I looked at him for a moment before he noticed me looking, took in the ordinary image of my father at a family gathering, the man I had known my entire life, whose face I could read in most configurations, whose particular emotional vocabulary I had been fluent in for as long as I could remember. Then he felt the look, the way people feel when they're being watched with a specific intention. He turned. Our eyes met across the room, and everything I needed to know was in his face in the next 3 seconds. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. The specific expression of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just watched the moment he always knew might come arrive in a form he couldn't control or manage or explain away before it landed. He didn't look away. I'll give him that. He held my gaze, with the stillness of someone who understands that looking away would be a kind of cowardice he doesn't want to add to everything else. But he also didn't move toward me, didn't cross the room, didn't offer anything in that look beyond the acknowledgement that the look itself communicated. I know what just happened. I have known this moment was possible. I have nothing to say right now that would be adequate. That was what his face said, in the 3 seconds before he looked down at his hands. I turned back to Daniel, who had been waiting with the patient quality of someone who has been waiting for years and can manage a few more minutes. I looked at him again, with different eyes than I had been looking with 30 seconds earlier, before the look across the room had confirmed everything. The familiarity that I had been trying to place since he walked through the door was no longer mysterious. I could see it now, clearly, not just in the architecture of the face, in the particular way he was standing, the angle of the shoulders, the way his hands were positioned. Small things, the kind of things that are invisible until they're suddenly the only things you can see. We were built from the same source. That was simply and undeniably true, and I had not known it existed until 11 minutes ago. I said to Daniel that we should find somewhere quieter. He nodded. We moved to a smaller room off the main hall. Someone had left 2 chairs near a window that looked out onto the garden. We sat, and I asked him to tell me from the beginning. He did. He had grown up knowing about my father. His mother had told him when he was old enough to understand. Not with bitterness from what I could tell, just with the particular honesty of a woman who had decided her son deserved to know where he came from even if what he came from was complicated. He had known my father's name, had known about the family, about me. For most of his adult life, he had carried the knowledge of a half-brother who had no idea he existed. He had thought about making contact before, multiple times, had always stopped himself, not because he was afraid exactly, because he didn't want to disrupt something, didn't want to arrive in a life that hadn't been built with space for him and force that space open through the disruption of his appearance. Then he heard about my grandmother's passing, through someone on my father's side who knew both worlds existed, even if those worlds had been kept separate. He had decided that if there was ever a moment to come, this was it. Not to confront anyone, not to make claims on anything, just to finally meet the people he was connected to by blood, but had never been allowed to know. I listened to all of this, in a small room with the chairs by the window, while the gathering continued in the hall next door. While my father stood somewhere on the other side of the wall, knowing exactly what was happening, and I felt the full range of it moving through me. The shock still present, but settling, making room for something more complex beneath it. We talked for 3 hours. I want to describe that time accurately because it was unlike any conversation I had ever had. Not because of what was said exactly, because of the particular quality of 2 people discovering each other across a gap that should never have existed. Finding out who the other person is while simultaneously finding out who you both are in relation to each other. That is a strange and specific experience. There's no template for it. No social script that covers the situation of meeting a sibling for the first time as an adult. In a side room at your grandmother's funeral. On the same day, you're already grieving. We started with the practical things, where he had grown up, what he did for work, the outline of a life lived in parallel to mine without either of us knowing the other was living it. He had grown up about 2 hours away. Different city, different circumstances. His mother had raised him largely alone after the relationship with my father ended. He didn't frame it with bitterness, just described it as the reality of his upbringing. A mother who was present and capable and who had built a life for them both without requiring anything from the man who had left it. He had studied something different from me, worked in a different field. The surface of his life shared very little with mine. But underneath the surface, something else was happening in that conversation. Something harder to describe, but impossible to ignore. The similarities arrived in small things first. The way he framed a thought before saying it. A particular pause before answering a question that I recognized as my own. The specific kind of humor. Dry. Emerging from observation rather than performance. Arriving without announcement. I found myself laughing at something he said, and then stopping because the laugh sounded familiar in a way that disoriented me. He noticed, said he had been having the same experience, that he had been prepared for this conversation in the sense of having thought about it for years, but that being in it was different from anything the preparation had produced. That meeting me was stranger and more real than he had expected. I asked him what he had imagined. He thought about it carefully before answering. Said he had imagined someone more different from himself. That he had told himself for years that sharing a father meant little. That identity is formed by upbringing and environment and the specific texture of a life you actually live, not by biology alone. He still believed that. But sitting in a room with me was complicating the belief, not disproving it, just adding something to it, because the similarities were not performance, were not the result of shared upbringing or shared environment or anything that could be explained by what we had in common. They came from somewhere prior to all of that, and recognizing them in another person for the first time was something neither of us had a clean way to process. I asked about my father, not defensively, just genuinely, what Daniel knew about him, what picture he had formed. He was careful here, said he had the picture a child forms when a parent is absent, incomplete, assembled from the edges of what his mother told him and the gaps she left. He didn't idealize my father, but he didn't condemn him either. Said he had spent a long time deciding how much energy to give to the anger, that he had decided the anger was real and legitimate, and also that it wasn't something he wanted to carry indefinitely, that what he wanted more than resolution of the anger was simply the experience of knowing the people he was connected to, of not being the only person in the world who was aware that this connection existed. I heard that clearly, the specific loneliness of being the only person who knows a true thing about themselves, of carrying knowledge that the people it involves most have been kept from. He had known about me for years, had wondered about me, had formed a picture of a person he had never met, and I had known nothing, had not wondered about him because I had no reason to wonder, had been living a version of my own life that was missing a chapter one didn't know was missing. We sat with that for a while, not with drama, just with the quiet weight of it. Two people in a room acknowledging something that had been true for decades and was only now being allowed to exist in the open. When we finally emerged, the gathering had thinned. Most people had gone. The hall felt emptier than it had. I looked for my father. He was still there, sitting in a chair near the door, waiting. He looked at me when I came back into the room, and then he looked at Daniel beside me, and he said nothing, just sat with what he had kept for so long, finally standing in front of him in the same room at the same time. I didn't speak to my father that day, not properly, not in the way the situation required. We exchanged a few words before people left. Functional, civil, the kind of exchange that holds a surface in place while everything underneath it waits for a better moment. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has things to say and understands that this is not the time to say them. I looked back with whatever my face was doing, which I couldn't fully account for. We left it there. Daniel and I exchanged numbers before he drove home, standing in the car park outside the hall. The cold air of a gray afternoon. A handshake that felt both appropriate and entirely insufficient for what the day had been. He said he was glad he had come. Said he understood if I needed time. That there was no pressure on what happened next. That he had waited this long and was genuinely comfortable with whatever pace made sense. I told him I was glad he had come too. And I meant it, even in the middle of everything I was carrying. Even with the shock still present and the anger at my father beginning to clarify beneath it. I was glad, because whatever else the day had been, something real had been found in it. Something that should have existed from the beginning and hadn't. And that finding it now was better than never finding it at all. I drove home in a specific kind of silence. Not peaceful, full. The particular fullness of a mind processing too many things simultaneously to settle on any one of them. Grief for my grandmother still present. The shock of Daniel still reverberating. The image of my father's face across the room returning on a loop. The 3 hours of conversation sitting in me like something that needed time to be properly absorbed. I didn't call anyone that evening. Didn't tell my partner everything immediately. Just sat with it. Let the day be what it had been without trying to explain it before I had explained it to myself. The anger at my father arrived more fully over the following days. Not explosively. It was never going to be explosive. That is not how I process things, and is not how this situation deserved to be processed. But arrived, steady and clear. The specific anger of someone who understands that a decision was made before they existed that shaped the entire landscape of their life without their knowledge or consent. My father had made a choice. To keep Daniel completely separate. To raise me in a version of our family that was missing a person who should have been in it. To carry that secret through decades of dinners and conversations and ordinary family life. Never offering a word of it. Not a hint. Not a moment of approaching it. Just the daily ongoing choice to keep the truth on one side of a wall and his family on the other. I thought about what that had cost Daniel. A childhood without a father present. A lifetime of knowing about a brother who didn't know he existed. Of being the keeper of a secret he hadn't chosen to keep and couldn't put down. That cost was not mine to carry. But I felt it. Because Daniel had described it across 3 hours with a lack of self-pity that made it land harder rather than softer. He had not been broken by it. He was a complete and capable person who had built a real life. But the absence had shaped things. In the particular way absences shape things. Not through what they are, through what they prevent. Daniel and I spoke on the phone about 2 weeks after the funeral. A conversation easier than the first one in some ways. Without the shock layered over everything. Without the particular electricity of 2 people encountering each other for the first time while simultaneously trying to manage the context they found each other in. Just 2 people talking, finding out more, asking the questions there hadn't been time for. The similarities were still there. In how we approached the conversation. In the things we found worth saying. In the things we didn't say because they didn't need to be said. We arranged to meet properly, in a normal setting, without a funeral as the frame. A lunch in a city neither of us lived in. Neutral ground, equal effort to get there. That lunch lasted 4 hours. And by the end of it, something had shifted from the category of shocking revelation into something quieter and more durable. The beginning of an actual relationship. Not brothers in the way people who grew up together are brothers. Something being built between adults who started from nothing and were choosing to build something anyway. That choice felt significant. More significant in some ways than a relationship that simply exists because circumstance created it. We were choosing it, both of us, with full knowledge of the gap that preceded it. And that choosing felt like something worth having. My father asked to speak with me privately about 6 weeks after the funeral. He called and said he thought it was time, that he had things he needed to say, and that he understood I had things I needed to hear. He said it simply, without preamble. In the direct way he communicates when he has decided something needs to be done and is going to do it regardless of how difficult it is. I said yes. We met at his house on a Saturday afternoon. My mother was not there. He had arranged that deliberately, which told me something about the scope of what he intended to say. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table I had sat at my entire life. For every version of ordinary and significant that family life produces. Now for this. He started by saying he had been trying to find the right words for 6 weeks, that he hadn't found them, that he was going to speak without them, and hoped that what he said was enough to begin something, even if it wasn't enough to complete it. I told him to go ahead. He told me about Daniel's mother. Not in detail, I needed to carry forever. Just enough. An overlap that had lasted less than a year before my parents' relationship had solidified into something permanent. A decision made when he discovered she was pregnant. Not a good decision. The decision of a young man who was frightened of what the truth would cost and chose the cost of the secret over the cost of the disclosure. He said he had told himself at the time that it was the practical thing, that 2 separate lives could be maintained cleanly, that Daniel would be provided for financially, that the families would simply never intersect. He said he understood now how wrong that had been, not because the practicality had failed. It had mostly held together for decades, but because the practicality had never been the right measure. The right measure was what it had cost Daniel. What had cost me in the version of a family I had been given. What had cost him in the daily, ongoing weight of knowing something that changed everything and saying nothing. He said he had thought about telling me many times, that he had come close more than once, but something always stopped him. Fear mostly, not of my anger, of my mother's, of what the truth would do to a marriage he had built on top of it, of the particular kind of destruction that a secret revealed at the wrong moment can produce that the secret itself never quite managed. He had kept it and kept it and kept it until my grandmother's funeral had made the keeping impossible, because Daniel had come, and Daniel had been right to come, and my father knew that. Even in the first moment of seeing him across the room, even in the moment of watching it land on me, he had known Daniel was right to come. I listened to all of it, without interrupting, without the specific performances of reaction that these conversations can produce when you are managing how you are being perceived as much as processing what you are being told. I just listened. When he finished, I sat quietly for a while. Then I told him what I needed to say, that I was angry, not at the affair, not at the complexity of a young life, making decisions it wasn't equipped to make well, at the decades, at every year of Daniel's life spent knowing he had a family he wasn't allowed to approach, at every conversation my father and I had ever had about family and loyalty and the things that matter. Conversations held over the top of a truth that would have changed them entirely. That was what I was angry at. The duration of it, the daily choice to maintain it, the casual ease with which a secret can be kept when you're the only one in the room who knows it. My father received that without deflecting it, said he understood, said he was sorry, not the reflexive sorry of someone trying to end a difficult conversation, the considered sorry of someone who has looked at something they did and understood its full weight. It didn't fix everything. I told him that honestly, that the conversation was necessary and I was glad we were having it, but that certain things take longer than a single afternoon to settle, that I would need time. He said he understood, said he was glad I was willing to have the conversation at all, that he hadn't known if I would be. On the drive home, I thought about my grandmother, about the things she had said in one of our last conversations, that she hoped the people she loved would find each other properly. She had known. I understood that now completely. She had known about Daniel for years, had been told or had discovered through the particular attention she paid to everything, and had kept it, not out of complicity exactly, out of the specific wisdom of someone who understands that some truths can only arrive when the moment is ready for them. She could have forced it, could have told my father to come clean, could have made contact with Daniel herself, and brought the whole thing into the open long before it arrived naturally. She chose not to, and then she had brought everyone together one last time, in the particular way she brought people together, without forcing anything, just creating the conditions in which things could happen if they were ready to happen. Daniel had been ready, had made his own decision to come, and my grandmother had given him the occasion. I don't know if that was intentional. I will never know, but I know that it felt like her. The quiet creation of conditions rather than the forcing of outcomes. The trust that what needed to emerge would emerge if the right people were in the same room at the same time. Daniel and I have lunch every 6 weeks or so now. It has become a regular thing. Not because we forced it, because it turns out that when you discover a person you should have known your entire life, you want to keep finding out who they are. He came to my daughter's birthday last spring, stood in my kitchen with a drink looking slightly uncertain about where to put himself, which I understood. He is still finding where he fits in the geography of a family he arrived at late. But he is finding it. My daughter introduced him to her friends as her uncle, without hesitation, without any awareness of the complexity attached to the word. Just uncle, because that is what he is. I watched him receive that. The specific expression of someone being given something they had not fully allowed themselves to expect. Something that should have been ordinary, but had never been ordinary. Just a word. Uncle. And him standing in my kitchen, holding his drink with something in his face that I didn't look at too long because it would have undone me. I think about the version of my life that doesn't include the day Daniel walked across that room. The version where he decided not to come to the funeral, where the gathering came and went, and everyone returned to their separate lives, and the truth remained in the place it had always lived. Inside my father. Alone. I went to my grandmother's funeral expecting to lose something. The anchor of the family. The fixed point. The person whose presence had made the whole structure feel permanent. And I did lose that. The grief of it is real and ongoing. But I also came home with something I had not known I was missing. A brother. Found in the last place I would have looked. On the hardest day of the year. In a room full of people saying goodbye. Sometimes the people who love us most protect the truth until the moment we are ready to receive it. And sometimes what looks like goodbye turns out to be the beginning of something we didn't know we needed. If this story stayed with you, the unexpected gift buried inside a day of loss, the quiet courage of someone who came anyway, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.